Hi everybody, welcome to the Poetry Vlog. I'm excited for our second Youth Poet Laureate installment for the month of March. We have Kara with us today. Kara, will you introduce yourself?
Hey, yeah, I'm Kara Jackson. I'm a poet and a singer-songwriter and activist, and I really advocate for Black queer women of color.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And for people who are both listening to the podcast and who are also watching the YouTube, first, Kara, tell us where else people can find you on the internet.
I'm on Instagram and Twitter at FridaHalo, FRIDAHALO. And you can catch me on Facebook if you know me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And for everyone listening and watching, I'll also link to those below. So don't worry, you have a clickable link if you don't want to take your fingers and type it in. And then today we're going to talk about Kara's own incredible work because she's an incredibly talented performer and writer. And I'm excited and thrilled to feature that here for all of you to see and hear if you're in the podcast version. And we're going to talk about Black feminist embodiment, right? And I think a little bit of queerness interrupts that as well. And ways that bodies are racialized and commodified, but also ways that kind of embodiment can be taken back in poetics. And we're going to use Lucille Clifton, one of my favorite poets actually, to talk about this. So we have a jam-packed episode, 20 minutes. We're going to get through it, and I'm extremely excited to have Kara with us. Kara, will you start us off by performing or reading one of your own pieces for everyone?
I'm going to read a poem of mine called Anthem for My Belly After Eating Too Much. I'm not trying to be all sad and sorry about my body, but I looked in the mirror and all the chips I've eaten this month have accumulated like schoolwork at the bottom of my tummy, my belly, a country I'm trying to love. My mouth is a lover devoted to you. My belly, the birds will string a song together with wind for you and your army of solids, militia of grease. Americans love excess, but we also love jeans and refuse to make excess comfortable in them. I step into a fashionable prison, my middle managed and fastened into suffering. My gracious gut, dutiful dome, I will wear a house for you that you can live in. Promise walls that embrace your growing flesh and watch you reach towards everything possible.
Thank you so much, Kara. That was gorgeous. Something I really love about this particular ode, basically, is that it's embracing things that oftentimes don't receive odes in terms of our own bodies and the contradictions in that, right? So you really lean into the kind of richness of saying belly and gut and solids and liquids, and we kind of enter this very tactile, almost amorphous space with you, while also kind of politically calling out the weird contradiction in the current contemporary pop culture era of both loving excess but not selling jeans that make excess comfortable. So it almost becomes a masochistic, very painful experience of never really fulfilling these cultural norms properly. It was really, really gorgeous. Will you tell us a bit about why you picked this poem for today?
Yeah, I have been really thinking about my body and its relationship with how it's received, not just my own personal relationship with my body, but how when I go outside, people are processing my body also and are looking at it and trying to understand it. And I think especially being a Black woman, there are so many versions of our body that are presented in the media. There are people who are trying to imitate our bodies, and even though I'm a product of that, and I try to celebrate my body in that way and try to own it and think about how people would like to mimic it, I still find myself looking down on my body and thinking about my body and all the things it could be instead of appreciating what my body just is. And I think that's hard for a lot of Black women, and we live in a culture where women are presented these versions of bodies and these thin women that we're supposed to all achieve and attain that type of body. And for Black women, it's complex because I don't think that we're really allowed that same narrative, allowed that same pining for that type of body. I think there's a lot of assumption when we talk about like eating disorders and just self-hatred in that way. I think that Black women are often left out of those conversations about our body, maybe because of the way that our bodies are idolized, but they're not idolized on us. They're not idolized with our skin. So I'm just really just trying to navigate that and trying to like own my body in that way, and picking, like you said, like a part of a body, of my body, that is not really often praised and is not really often thought about. Like I don't really think about my stomach when I think about the parts that I like the most about myself. And so I was really trying to like push that narrative onto and really think about my gut as something that was growing and expanding and something, and making those words good and not negative.
Yeah. And in fact, I think that the ode goes from something that is like very like, I'm using like a lot, so let me think careful about what I'm trying to say. You start in the corporeal, like the body, as like this extremely concrete thing, and you're not shy about also moving into a more reverent space for it as well by the end, where you're like, I will build a house for you that will allow you, like there's this kind of like care that you're insistently taking. I actually think it's a really good writing prompt even to tell people, try writing an ode to a part of your body that your social identity would tell you to not write an ode to, you know. What does writing poetry and performing poetry especially offer you in thinking through the violent ways, right, that both race and gender meet in women of color bodies, especially for Black women, right, and the expectations around it, when they're desirable, when they're not desirable, when you're told you're desirable or not? How does poetry, like, what does it do for you with that?
I think with poetry, I could access language and use language to present myself differently than I was being perceived. I think that getting on stage and like getting to have control over like what I say about myself versus letting someone else say something about myself is always valuable. I think more so with written poems, I think just being able to like have my words on the page and just have them be solidified and written in ink and just like set in stone. I think sometimes with performing like spoken word poetry specifically, I think that Black bodies are still commodified, and even just like the term like Black body like is so impersonal. It's so like dehumanizing. Like still not like I have a human body. I am a person, and like I'm living in this body. I'm not just like some like noun. I'm like a proper noun, and thinking about and my language, making myself proper and making myself something that is worth time, and like taking the time to like sit with my language and the words that I'm using. So I think that's what poetry really does for me in terms of my body.
Yeah. I love that too, because it's like you're saying actually already, if you just say like Black bodies, it's like this very pluralized, depersonalized kind of other kind of violence, right? And on the other hand, there's a way of reclaiming the body through poetry that you're pointing out allows for a repersonalization of it, as sort of like claiming to a particular experience that like not everybody gets to have total access to, but that they also don't get to like foreclose or cut off. And I find also that your point about how then it becomes commodified yet again in these spaces, right? Like slam poets going viral on the internet, and then it becomes this other kind of like fetishizing or commodifying a type of like painful experience, right? Or a type of healing. And it becomes like, I'm sure, a very painful paradox, right? How do you navigate that paradox, right? Because you're obviously a very gifted, well, it might not be obvious to you, but it's obvious to me that you're a very gifted poet on page and in performance. And so you're having to constantly navigate that, like even in the youth poet laureate system, right? So how do you navigate that? Where do you find hope actually in navigating that too?
I'm still trying to navigate through that paradox. I don't do slam poetry anymore. I have made a point to not slam anymore, and making that taking that step was really important for me in terms of understanding who I was as a poet, and also just kind of like sticking it to that paradox and just completely just like dismantling the things that I had internalized also from being a slam poet. But yeah, it's still just a constant struggle to navigate through that, because even like with the role, like being the Youth Poet Laureate of Chicago, I'm expected to show up and perform at these spaces, and and also I'm just an introvert. Like, I don't really like performing in general, but I have definitely tried to be more intentional about where I'm performing and who I'm performing in front of, like to the extent that I can, right? Because I'm still like young and also just need to make money. So sometimes I am just performing in front of like a board of like rich white people, and sometimes that's just like what has to happen. But I think even in those spaces, still trying to find ways to like really like stick it to the people in those spaces, you know, like singing. I like sing stuff and perform in that way also, and I think that has been interesting for me, because I will get into those spaces and I'll have like my guitars, I'll have like all my guitars, and people will be like, are you going to do spoken word, are you going to do slam poetry? And it's like, well, I'm on this like bill to sing songs for you, you know. So like just trying to like really be intentional about like what I'm about and making sure that's understood right off the bat before like 80 questions are asked.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to me too, because I feel like it's such an obvious binary, like print-based poet versus slam poet, and they're like such racialized categories, and it's so violent to expect people to perform the very pain that they're also inflicting on someone, right? I know Dennis Smith talks a lot about this, how people always ask them like, what's the difference between like your performance work and your print-based work, as if they're like this binaristic difference, and there's this expectation of them that they perform, you know. And it's an incredibly stressful pressure. Like you're saying, it requires you to like economize your work in a way that's like packageable for whiteness, basically, which is incredible. But at the same time, like you have these things you need to say for yourself. So it's like this constant paradox that you're having to operate within. I actually didn't know that you were a musician in addition to like writer, poet person. Can you talk for a minute about that? I know it's like off our topic for today, but I grew up in a family of musicians. I was raised Pentecostal, so I grew up with like music. My parents ran the music program. Like that's just kind of always in the back of my mind with poetry. So can I just nerd out and selfishly ask us to detour for a second and talk about your music work?
I love talking. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that I'm a musician, because like once I started doing poetry, I just became like the poetry girl. Like in my school, everybody's like, that's the one who writes poetry. But I've been singing for like my entire life, and I started playing the guitar when I was like 10 or like 11. And I really make mainly like folk music or like jazz inspired music, or just kind of whatever comes out. But I think those are the two genres that I pull the most from. But I think my love for poetry really was born from my love for music, and particularly lyricism. And everybody makes the connection, I think, specifically with like hip hop and like poetics and like the hip hop poetics, and especially in a place like Chicago, where like this is kind of the home for like the breakbeat poets and all of that wonderful stuff. But yeah, for me, I really grew up with like the lyricism of like old folk songs, like listening to Joan Baez and having like Joni Mitchell as influences, and like Roberta Flack and like Marvin Gaye and all these people who are just writing really beautiful, eloquent things, but then like putting them to music and singing them. And that really just helped me understand, like, to connect back to like what we were talking about, just like my body also, because just like singing is such a physical activity, and thinking about my breath and like thinking about like my diaphragm, it has really made me think about my body and as like a vessel and as something that I need to take care of in order to do the things that I love also. So just thinking about like, I mean, everybody's talking about like self-care and stuff now. I think singing has really made me like tap into like being more aware of my body and like thinking of it as something that I'm like living in and like maintaining, and it's like a machine that I am operating.
Yeah, I love that. We're going to just go with this detour, actually, because originally this project was supposed to be poetry and pop culture, but whenever I talk to other poets, they're like, yeah, pop culture. Like you said, aside. And I'm like, no, really, though. Like, poetry is happening in the musical arts today. Like, they are the bards of now, you know? And it was happening in cultures that aren't Western European, like ad nauseum, as a way of holding memory in the body. Like, that matters, you know? So I get like extremely stoked when I talk to poets who also like tap into that musical dimension. And especially because of what you're talking about in terms of the ways that it forces you to think about acts as physical that you don't think of as physical, right? Like you don't get to make it abstract because the performance of music is always so physically elaborate, you know? There's a couple reading suggestions, and I'd love it if you tagged more on for folks that I'd like to make. One is, I'm forgetting the author's name, which is really bad of me, but it's Black Pentecostal Breath, and it's an entire book on like breath, race, queer kinship, and like the kind of work that we do politically through like reckoning with the breath. Kaplan has a book called Rhymes Challenge, which talks about how like formal poetry is alive in these sort of like hip hop and R&B and pop music cultures, in ways that it's become a way of like subverting cultural norms through like rhyme and rhythms, like communication with each other. And then I'm thinking of the Gray Album by Kevin Young. Also really difficult. It didn't get great reviews, but I love it because it gives a sort of history, honestly, of like a lot of white pop cultures, like rock and stuff like that, stealing from non-white pop cultures, right? In ways that gets repeated in poetry worlds too. Like it kind of merges the two and gives a history. We're about to go into your suggestion anyway for reading. So do you have any reading suggestions or viewing suggestions or listening suggestions for people?
Yeah, I am always listening to things. I listen to music probably more than the average person. And now I'm tracking my Apple Music. Like I can analyze my my listening history. And so it's really bad because I will just spend like hundreds of minutes listening to like the same thing. But I've really been listening to Solange's latest album. I'm a very big Solange fan. And I just literally, I mean, like A Seat at the Table also just has like influenced me so much. And so now to have another album from her is great. And I've been listening to a lot of like girl bands also, like Girlpool, particularly their first EP. I'm like blanking on the name, but it's like 15 minutes, like the entire, it's like 8 songs and it's 15 minutes and it's so like, it's like juvenile, but also just like at the same time, I love like the wisdom because they were in like high school when they made it. And like, I love like the high schoolers and their wisdom and like all the things that they provide. Yeah. And so, yeah, those are some things I've been listening to. And I just have been reading everything. I've been reading a lot of James Baldwin lately, especially just with like If Beale Street Could Talk coming out. I had to reread that before I saw it because it was just...
I know that for a fact that one of our listener fans, Ibuka, hi Ibuka, has been really digging James Baldwin. Do you have a particular title by James Baldwin you'd recommend?
Yeah, I really like Notes on the Native Son. Like, I think that book, just every time I read it, I have like a life crisis. I just like reanalyze my entire life, and that's kind of just a good thing at the same time because it's just like I live in a suburb and I'm always just like thinking about like how I fit into this suburb and just like even like how does my body, like, I mean, thinking about my body, like I grew up around a lot of white girls and I didn't understand how like I could live in my body when it didn't look like theirs. And like, I was so confused because I would be around my relatives and they would say, oh, well, you are like very small. But I was like, but I can't fit into like Lululemon. So I'm confused. Yeah. So that's really, James Baldwin is really good for that. And also Toni Morrison. I've been reading Playing in the Dark.
Yes, it's actually my favorite of her works, and nobody talks about it.
Nobody says anything about the book, and it literally, like, I read it in, like, a day, and I was like, I have to read it. Transformed. Yeah, it ended up becoming, like, the cornerstone of my entire method for my doctoral program, and people were like, what? And I'm like, no, seriously. Yeah. Like, I have my
one of my only like toy investments was like a bomb pair of like noise canceling headphones. And I think my roommate thinks I'm nuts because I always walk around with them on and I always have to be listening to something.
Me too. Mine headphones are noise canceling too.
Yeah, I will like never go without them again. But there's just something about, I make my students write to a different song every day in class. And then Jamila Woods, that's it, because you're in the Chicago area. Are you a fan of Jamila Woods?
Yes, I love, Jamila Woods is one of my mentors. So, yeah. I love her. I'm really excited about her new album that's coming out in May, I believe. I've heard it, actually, and it literally is incredible. It is going to be so incredible, and everything that woman does is just incredible. I could probably have a whole segment about Jamila Woods.
Yeah, we could actually. I would not turn that down if you want to go back on and do a whole segment on her work.
Oh my God, She's in Heaven is like one of the greatest things to ever just exist. That album is so great, and it's just so awesome. Also, to just know her as a teacher also, and to know how much she just really cares about the work that she's doing and how much she cares about her students, and just most of these things, most of my material, this Lucille Clifton poem, most of the stuff that I engage with is probably because of Jamila, and just how dedicated she is to making sure we know about these things and engaging with us about poetry and about music and everything. So shout out Jamila Woods.
I admire that more than people being talented at what they do. It's interesting doing this project. This might get cut out, but I interview a lot of people, and there's such a difference between someone who is a generous teacher mind, they want to pass on what they know and create connections around an archive, essentially, right? And people who are there because they want their face on YouTube.
Right.
It's a stark difference. I had a guest on who shall not be named, but I had to edit her episode so heavily to make her sound less involved. And I remember when I told her our number one fan base, so to speak, is undergrads, which is my goal. I think that youth are the future. So if they like what's happening on here, good. And she was just oh, I didn't realize that. Right? And I was just if you ever get a teaching job, I'm gonna anonymously phone in.
Yeah. It's just so important.
And there is nothing I could go on and on more about than the connection between poetry and music. So, please let Jamila know. She has a whole fan base out here in Seattle. I have a student that wants to do a whole episode dedicated to her, actually. So she's...
I will tell her. Yeah. I will see her tomorrow, so I will tell her.
Let her know she's got some people fangirling hard out here. In a real way.
It's so important to talk about lineage. For me, I'm obsessed with lineage. I just love understanding, or just trying to understand where I come from, and who I'm influencing and who's coming behind me. And I think that's definitely also a result of just being around Jamila and being around young Chicago authors, where I mostly do a lot of my poetry and stuff, because they really encourage you to understand where you come from, but also make a point to make sure somebody's coming after you. My favorite Toni Morrison quote is how she tells all of her students so if you got free, I'm paraphrasing because I'm not as brilliant as Toni Morrison, but if you got free, then your job is now to make sure someone else is getting free. This is not a candy grab bag game, and I think that that's just really important. When I can't talk about my work without talking about somebody else's work. So
we are so on the same wavelength about this. I think it's at the crux for me of any work that poets should be doing. It's not a grab for power. It's about redistributing power. And that includes resources, and being transparent about resources. Lucille Clifton, before we run out of time today, why did you bring her, and will you read us a piece from her work?
I love Lucille Clifton. I think that it's brilliant that she just was so devoted to her craft, but also didn't really become acknowledged until she was a grandmother. I think that's for me, something that's so inspiring, because we talk about artists, especially in a time now where people are just obsessed with youth. And I just always advocate for young people. Just like the idea that like I'm supposed to be like some successful person at 25 when I could be 70 and I could be putting out my first book of poems. I like just the idea that we can dismantle that timeline and we can still be artists also and practice art without telling everybody, without everybody knowing. And like art can be a private and like personal thing. I think Lucille Clifton was just doing her thing and was like writing these amazing things, but she was like, I have kids. Like I have to like cook and like work and be a human being. And like I love separating. I mean, like I think that I will always identify as an artist, but I'm also just like a human. And I think Lucille Clifton just like brings so much humanity to her work and just like articulates so many feelings that I just have all the time.
I actually really love what you're highlighting here too, which is that in the contemporary poetry moment, it's like there's been an explosion, right? Like quite literally readership in poetry has doubled in the last 4 years, which isn't exactly a mystery. I mean, we have the worst president ever, so of course. But like it creates this pressure or this idea that your whole identity in life has to be your work. And I think it's actually super violent, especially because it's mostly marginalized people having to do that work. And it's like, no, you get to shut the notebook, shut down the computer and watch, like, in my case, Grey's Anatomy, and like enjoy it. You could like go to dinner with someone and talk about something besides your work, and it's actually a super capitalist concept. So it's ironic that it's so deeply embedded in it. So it's extremely thrilling to hear that you've been introduced to this poet and that you're inspired by that boundary, basically, where she's like, my goal is not to publish, my goal is to live, and live well and pass on. And that's a different goal, Now will you go ahead and read for us now that I've officially pontificated?
I'm going to read her poem, Homage to My Hips. Mm-hmm. These hips are big hips. They need space to move around in. They don't fit into little petty places. These hips are free hips. They don't like to be held back. These hips have never been enslaved. They go where they want to go. They do what they want to do. These hips are mighty hips. These hips are magic hips. I have known them to put a spell on a man and spin him like a top.
Yeah, I love that poem. There's the obvious connection, right, to your own like kind of ode to your belly. Right. But will you talk more about why you selected this poem?
I think similar to my poem, I like the way that she highlights a part of the body that is so wide and expanding. I like the idea of owning something about yourself that has the potential to grow also. I think that Lucille also does a good job of just like owning herself in the poem. Like the poem is entirely about herself in a way that I think is like really important for Black women, because even though she mentions a man, like the action, like spin him like a top, like that's like she's doing that, like she's in control of that. And I think it's so important for like Black women to also understand their bodies and like how they're in control of them, and how like even though there's such an expectation, I think, for Black poets and like Black queer women and femmes to kind of acknowledge Black men and acknowledge like how we're supposed to be helping them or something. And I think that like while the obligation is obviously born out of some type of like subservience, I like the idea of like dismantling that and being like, no, these verbs are like, I'm doing this action for myself. Like I like my own hips and like I will spin you like a top, but also like I'm not enslaved. Like this is between me and my hips. So I love the way that Lucille Clifton owns herself and like is very unapologetic in that way.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how you're pointing out how verbs function in the poem then, right? In ways that like oftentimes we don't notice that verbs in poems, especially ones that get published popularly by Black women, are about like a more complicated verb relationship, right? That decenters themselves yet again. And I also love that it's coming from the body. Like the body is doing the things as well. Like she's taking her own hips and having them do it. So it's not participating in this like abstract ideal of what someone can do in order to be like valuable in doing things. So I really love that. So, Kara, thank you so much for being on the Poetry Vlog today and being in coalition and doing this incredibly important work, and for being open to the detours as they came up and being vulnerable and open with us about what matters to you in your art and your writing and your music and your life beyond that. Everybody who's listening, please leave a comment being like, yo, Kara, that was so awesome. Thank you. Right? Because it's hard to be vulnerable on YouTube and then you have like radio silence. And I'm appreciative that people are willing to do that. So please let Kara know how rad she is here. In addition, I'd be curious to know if you've ever written a poem to your body parts, right? Or to your body, like odes to parts of your body, especially if you are a Black female or brown female or have had different types of like violence enforced upon your body, right? And if you find that also empowering. So some comments that we could hear from you all. In terms of the future of this project, make sure you also follow Kara over on Instagram and Twitter. The links are below, and she mentioned them at the beginning of the episode, so check those out. The Poetry Vlog is also merged with my personal Instagram for now, so Chelsea_Grimmer, because social media is really difficult for me and I was just tired of managing two. So it's really just that simple. So you can find Instagram content there, the Facebook page, Twitter, I'm kind of active on. I also don't like Twitter much, but I'm working on it. So follow us there, leave your comments and your feedback. And then if you sign up for the newsletter at the website, I'll send a snail mail thank you, because I like snail mail and it's really just an excuse to send snail mail. And that's about it. Anything else, Kara?
No.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Like, comment, subscribe, yada, 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 and have a lovely day. Bye.